Wow. For this deep dive, you've really given us like a ton of material.
Yeah.
It seems like you're really interested in, well, how the British Empire, this huge, powerful force, started to face some serious pushback between 1890 and 1914.
Yeah.
And we've got sources here covering everything from like rumblings of unrest in India to skirmishes in Somaliland, even all the way to the economic tug of war in Iran.
It's a fascinating period to look at because it really exposes those vulnerabilities of the British Empire.
Okay.
You start to see how their control, wasn't just about military force.
Right.
It was about managing this really complex web of political and economic interests, and often with some pretty shaky justifications.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little.
Yeah.
Our mission, right, in this deep dive is to go beyond just the what of these challenges.
Well,
We want to really understand the why.
Yeah.
Why did these movements emerge? What tactics did the British use to try and maintain their grip on all these different places?
Yeah.
And what were the long-term consequences?
Yeah, and some of those consequences I think might surprise you.
Okay.
One thing that you'll notice right away in looking at this is the sheer variety of ways that people resisted British influence. We're talking, organized political movements, religious uprisings, even some pretty clever economic strategies.
Wow.
It's really a testament to human ingenuity when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's start with India.
Okay.
Now, India had already seen its share of resistance, right?
Oh, yeah.
But during this time, things shifted toward more organized political movements.
Right.
Like, what was going on?
Well, a central figure in this shift was Bal Gangadhar Tilak.
Okay.
He was this brilliant nationalist leader who, really understood the power of the press.
Yeah.
And his newspaper, Khazari, was really like a megaphone for anti-British sentiment.
And he wasn't afraid to get controversial.
No, not at all.
Was he? I mean,
Yeah.
there was that attempted assassination in 1908, right?
Yes. In 1908, two young men who were very much inspired by Tilak's writings, they tried to assassinate a British official.
Right.
And tragically, they ended up killing two innocent women instead.
Oh, wow.
And it really, it highlights the intensity of the emotions at the time.
Yeah.
Tilak was actually arrested for defending them.
Wow.
And his imprisonment just made him a martyr in the eyes of many Indians.
Yeah, so he kind of became this symbol of defiance. And it's interesting that even a British woman, Annie Besant, supported him.
Right.
That must have raised some eyebrows, right?
Oh, it definitely did.
Yeah.
Besant was she was a prominent theosophist and a strong advocate for Indian self-governance. And she really saw the value in uniting Hindus and Muslims in this struggle for independence.
So working together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And alongside Tilak's movement, you also have, groups like the Young India Society emerging and really pushing for more radical action.
Okay, so who were they?
Well, the Young India Society was founded by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar and his brother.
Okay.
And they attracted a lot of young revolutionaries. And they were really kind of pushing the boundaries of what was considered, acceptable resistance.
So pushing the envelope a little bit.
Yeah, they were definitely more radical.
Okay.
Then in 1905, the British administration made a decision that really, it backfired spectacularly.
Oh, boy.
They decided to partition Bengal.
Okay, so what was the thinking there? What were they trying to accomplish?
Well, the viceroy at the time, Lord Curzon, he believed that by dividing the province along religious lines,
Okay.
creating a Muslim East Bengal and a Hindu West Bengal, he thought this would weaken the nationalist movement.
So the classic divide and conquer.
Exactly. Classic divide and conquer.
But it totally blew up in their faces.
It totally did. Bengalis, both Hindu and Muslim, they saw through it and united in opposition.
Wow.
And this partition sparked a 6-year uprising that the British really struggled to contain. In the end, they were forced to reunite Bengal in 1911.
Wow. Talk about a miscalculation.
Yeah, big miscalculation.
But the violence didn't end there, right?
No.
Just a few years later, in 1909, 2 British officials were assassinated by Indian revolutionaries.
Yes, and those assassinations sent, shockwaves through the British administration.
Yeah, I bet.
They responded with this crackdown, imprisoning activists, shutting down newspapers, and really just trying to stifle any form of dissent.
So it seems like the British were stuck in this vicious cycle. Repression leading to more resistance, leading to even harsher repression. Were they just completely out of touch with what was happening in India?
I think they were certainly struggling to adapt.
Okay.
And amidst all this turmoil, a new idea started gaining traction.
Yeah.
Swadeshi.
Okay, so what does that mean, Swadeshi?
Well, Swadeshi basically means self-reliance.
Okay.
And it encouraged Indians to boycott British goods and really embrace, local products. And it was this powerful way to hit back at the British economically, but also to assert this sense of cultural independence.
So are we seeing, like, the early seeds of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance being planted here?
Absolutely. This idea of resisting oppression through economic and social means rather than violence really took hold during this period.
Okay.
And by 1914, it was becoming increasingly clear that the British couldn't simply suppress the desire for independence.
Education and nationalist sentiment had spread too far, too deep.
Exactly. The genie was out of the bottle.
Yeah.
India was on a path towards self-determination, and the events of this period were really crucial in shaping that journey.
Okay, so while things were heating up in India,
Yeah.
there were also fires burning in Africa, though often taking different forms.
Right.
Let's zoom in on Somaliland first.
Okay, this is where we encounter this truly captivating figure, Muhammad Abdullah Hassan,
Okay.
who the British rather dismissively nicknamed the Mad Mullah.
I get the feeling that nickname doesn't quite capture the complexity of the man.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He was a charismatic leader, a skilled military strategist, and a devout Muslim who saw British encroachment as a threat to his people's way of life.
So he was a lot of things.
Yeah, multifaceted.
But he managed to hold the British at bay for over 2 decades.
That's right. For 20 years, he led these dervish forces in a guerrilla war against the British, launching raids, building forts, and really just frustrating their attempts to control the region.
Oh.
And his resistance was deeply religious, fueled by his opposition to Christianity and European influence.
So he wasn't just a religious figurehead. He was a military leader who understood how to exploit the terrain and hit the British where it hurt.
Exactly. And his success in tying down British troops and resources for so long, it really highlights the challenges of imposing colonial rule in a place with, strong local leadership.
But Somaliland wasn't the only place in Africa where the British faced resistance. In 1896, there was a brief but pretty intense uprising in Zanzibar, wasn't there?
Yes, led by Khalid bin Bargash, a rival claimant to the Sultanate.
Okay.
And he challenged the British-backed Sultan and briefly seized control of the palace.
It sounded like a pretty daring move. How did the British react to that?
Swiftly and decisively.
As you might expect.
As you might expect, yeah. They bombarded the palace, forcing Bargash to seek refuge in the German consulate.
Oh, wow.
He was then exiled to German East Africa.
So a clear demonstration of British naval power and their determination to maintain control over this strategically important island.
Yeah.
They weren't messing around.
Not when it came to protecting their interests.
Yeah.
And then we have West Africa, where resistance took a more economic form with the Hutt tax rebellion in Sierra Leone in 1898.
Taxes, those rarely go down well, do they?
Not usually, no, especially when they're seen as, as unfair and exploitative, which this one definitely was.
Right.
The British governor, Frederick Cardew, imposed this tax on each dwelling as a way to raise revenue for the colony.
Okay.
But it was deeply unpopular.
Yeah.
Seen as just another way for the British to extract wealth from the people.
So it wasn't just the tax itself, it was what it represented, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like another layer of British control and taking their resources.
Right, and to add fuel to the fire.
Uh-oh.
Cardew also shifted the responsibility for road maintenance from the government to local chiefs.
Okay.
So essentially, they were being forced to fund infrastructure projects that mainly benefited the British.
So they were getting taxed and then told to do unpaid labor.
Pretty much.
No wonder they revolted.
Yeah, the chiefs and their followers refused to pay the tax or, contribute to the road work. And Cardew's response was swift and brutal.
Oh, no.
He ordered the execution of 96 chiefs.
Wow, that seems incredibly harsh, even for the standards of the time.
It was a shocking display of force that really undermined those British claims of bringing civilization to Africa.
Yeah, civilization with air quotes.
Exactly.
So this Hutt tax rebellion, along with the resistance in Somaliland and Zanzibar, shows us that opposition to British rule in Africa was multifaceted.
Definitely.
It was rooted in resentment of economic exploitation, anger at political manipulation,
Right.
and a deep-seated desire to protect their own cultures and ways of life.
Exactly. And despite their different approaches, these resistance movements all shared this common thread.
What's that?
This determination to protect their autonomy and push back against British control over their lives and livelihoods.
It really does seem like wherever the British went, they faced pushback.
They did, yeah.
But Sudan, from what I've read, presented a particularly brutal and costly set of challenges.
Yeah, Sudan had already been a source of humiliation and resentment for the British.
Yeah.
Remember the Mahdist forces who besieged Khartoum in 1884 and 1885?
Right, and the death of General Charles Gordon, which became like a rallying cry for revenge back in Britain.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like the British were very determined to avenge that loss and reassert their dominance.
Oh, absolutely. And when they returned to Sudan in 1898, this time under the command of General Horatio Kitchener,
Okay.
there was a very, very strong sense of unfinished business.
And Kitchener was known for his ruthless efficiency, wasn't he?
He was. He was a brilliant military strategist.
Okay.
He oversaw the construction of the Sudan Military Railway,
Mm.
which was this marvel of engineering that allowed him to move troops and supplies really rapidly across that vast Sudanese landscape.
So he was bringing the full force of modern technology to bear on this campaign?
He was. And it proved decisive in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898.
Uh-huh.
The British, armed with machine guns and artillery, they faced the Mahdist warriors who, fought very bravely but were simply outmatched.
Yeah, the casualty figures for that battle are staggering.
They are.
Over 11,000 Mahdist soldiers killed, compared to just a handful of British losses.
It was a devastating victory for the British.
Yeah.
But it also raised some uncomfortable questions about their conduct.
Like what?
Well, there were reports of looting and the execution of wounded Mahdist fighters after the battle.
So even though it was a decisive victory, it sounds like it was a morally complicated one.
Very much so.
So it seems like this victory at Omdurman, while, decisive, didn't exactly bring peace and stability to Sudan. Weren't there still challenges to British rule?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Despite their victory at Omdurman, the British faced ongoing resistance from this Mahdist movement. Uprisings continued to flare up.
Okay.
And it forced them to maintain a large military presence and, constantly be ready to quell these rebellions.
So they were kind of stuck in this quagmire, trying to impose their control on a population that clearly resented their presence.
Right.
So how did they try to balance this desire for control with the need to, to actually govern the region?
Yeah, it was a tough balancing act, Yeah. On the one hand, they were determined to exploit Sudan's resources.
Okay.
Particularly its fertile land along the Nile River.
Right.
And they launched these ambitious development projects like the Gezira Scheme.
Okay. What was that?
Well, the Gezira Scheme was this massive irrigation project designed to boost cotton production.
So they were trying to make Sudan an economic asset for the empire?
Yeah, they were trying to turn it into this profit-making machine.
Did it work? Was it successful?
To a degree, yeah. The Gezira Scheme did increase cotton production and it did generate revenue.
Okay.
But, on the other hand, they faced this constant resistance from the Sudanese people, and the cost of maintaining control both in terms of human life and financial resources, it was enormous.
It sounds like a classic case of, imperial ambition clashing with the realities on the ground.
Yeah.
Did the British ever stop to question whether it was all worth it?
Well, that's a question that historians still debate today.
Yeah.
But the experience in Sudan, I think it really highlights these dilemmas.
Okay.
And contradictions at the heart of the British Empire. They were constantly trying to balance this desire for profit and power with the realities of local resistance and the moral complexities of their actions.
Right. And speaking of moral complexities, let's turn our attention to South Africa and the Second Boer War.
Okay.
A conflict that really, I think, exposed the brutality of British imperialism.
Yeah.
Now, this wasn't just some random skirmish, right? It seems like there was a lot of bad blood between the British and the Boers.
That's right. The Second Boer War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902, was really the culmination of decades of tension.
Wow.
You have to remember that the Boers, who were descendants of Dutch settlers, they had established their own republics in South Africa, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and they were fiercely independent.
Yeah.
And had their own, their own ways of life, their own culture.
But the discovery of gold in the Transvaal in the 1880s really changed the dynamic.
Oh, it absolutely did. Yeah, the gold rush brought thousands of British prospectors called Uitlanders
Okay.
to the Transvaal, and this influx of outsiders led to, quite a bit of friction with the Boers,
Yeah.
who saw their land, their culture, their political control being threatened.
And then to make things even more complicated, the Boers were like really reluctant to grant full voting rights to these Uitlanders.
Yeah, that became a major point of contention. The British argued for equal rights for their citizens.
Right.
And they used this issue to try and, increase their influence in the Transvaal.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Boers, who were led by President Paul Kruger, they feared that giving Uitlanders the vote would undermine their control.
So you have this clash of ideologies, economic interests, political ambitions, all kind of swirling around. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. And in 1899, negotiations between Kruger and the British High Commissioner, Alfred Milner, completely broke down. Milner was, he was a staunch imperialist.
Okay.
And he was determined to assert British dominance in South Africa.
So he wasn't really interested in compromise?
Not really, no. He saw the Boers as an obstacle to his vision of a united South Africa under the British flag.
Okay.
And sensing that war was pretty much inevitable, Kruger issued this ultimatum to the British.
Wow.
Demanding that they withdraw their troops from the border.
That seems like a pretty bold move.
It was a gamble, for sure.
Yeah.
He probably knew that war was, the most likely outcome.
Right.
And as expected, the British, they saw this as an insult to their authority.
Yeah.
They rejected the ultimatum and war was declared.
And this wasn't a walk in the park for the British, was it?
No, not at all. The Boers, though, outnumbered. They were skilled marksmen.
Okay.
And masters of guerrilla warfare. They knew the terrain intimately, and they used it to their advantage, ambushing British columns and inflicting heavy casualties.
So the British, used to fighting these more conventional battles.
Right.
They were caught off guard.
Exactly. They were initially ill-prepared for the Boers' mobility and tenacity.
And the war dragged on much longer than anyone had anticipated.
Oh, yeah.
And the body count on both sides started to climb.
It did.
I imagine the news of these setbacks, these losses, caused quite a stir back in Britain.
Yeah.
How did the British public react to this unexpected turn of events?
Well, there was a mixture of shock and anger.
Okay.
And a determination to crush the Boer resistance.
Okay.
And the British government came under, intense pressure to achieve a decisive victory.
Right. They couldn't let this relatively small group of farmers defy the might of the British Empire.
Exactly. So they had to change their strategy.
So what did they do?
Well, they brought in Lord Kitchener.
Oh, okay.
The hero of Sudan, to take command.
Yeah.
And Kitchener was, he was known for his ruthlessness.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to use, pretty brutal tactics to achieve his objectives.
What kind of tactics are we talking about here?
Well, he implemented a scorched earth policy, ordering the systematic destruction of Boer farms and crops and livestock.
Wow.
The idea was to deprive the Boers of their resources and, break their will to fight.
That sounds incredibly destructive.
It was.
What about the Boer civilians?
Yeah.
Weren't they caught in the crossfire?
Absolutely. And to control that Boer civilian population, Kitchener ordered the construction of concentration camps.
Concentration camps?
Yes.
Those have a pretty chilling history.
Yeah, you're right to be concerned. These camps were, hastily built and overcrowded.
Yeah.
And they became sites of immense suffering.
Wow.
Thousands of Boer women and children were interned in these camps where disease and malnutrition were rampant.
Were the British authorities aware of the conditions in these camps?
Well, there were certainly attempts to cover up the worst of it. But some brave individuals, like Emily Hobhouse, who was this British welfare worker,
Right.
she risked her own safety to expose what was happening.
Wow.
And she documented this appalling lack of sanitation, the inadequate food and medical care, and the tragically high death rates, particularly among children.
Her reports must have caused like a scandal back in Britain.
They did. Hobhouse's accounts, along with, photographs smuggled out of the camps, they sparked outrage and condemnation.
Yeah.
And the British government was forced to, acknowledge the problems and make some improvements.
Okay.
But the damage to their reputation was done.
It seems like the Second Boer War really, really tarnished the image of the British Empire.
It certainly did. Here they were claiming to be this civilizing force,
Right.
yet engaging in tactics that, that resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians.
So even though the British ultimately won the war, forcing the Boers to surrender in 1902,
Yeah.
it sounds like a very hollow victory. What was the lasting impact of this conflict?
Well, the Second Boer War really exposed the limitations of British military power. And it revealed the brutal side of their imperial project.
Yeah.
And it sparked this wave of self-criticism back home.
Great.
It raised these profound questions about the costs and consequences of empire.
Okay, let's shift gears geographically a little bit and talk about Iran.
Right.
As we touched on earlier, it wasn't a British colony, right?
Right.
In the traditional sense.
Yeah.
But the British had this significant, economic influence there.
They did.
Especially when it came to oil.
Right.
So can you unpack this for us a little bit more?
Sure. Iran's story in this period highlights a different kind of imperial influence.
Okay.
One based less on direct rule and more on economic control.
Okay.
Often exercised through these powerful private companies. You see, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, oil was rapidly becoming this strategically vital resource. Right. And Iran was sitting on these vast reserves.
So the British saw an opportunity to secure those resources for themselves.
Exactly.
How did they go about doing that?
Well, in 1901, a British businessman named William Knox D'Arcy, he struck this deal with the Shah of Iran.
Okay.
And he obtained a concession granting him exclusive rights.
Wow.
To explore for and extract oil for a period of 60 years.
60 years? That's a long time.
It is, yeah, and it covered a huge swath of Iranian territory.
So what did the Shah get in return?
He received a relatively small royalty
Okay.
on any oil that was found. So it was a deal that heavily favored the British.
So basically they were getting access to Iran's oil wealth for a pittance.
Pretty much, yeah.
Did D'Arcy actually find oil?
He did. After years of searching, his team struck oil in 1908 in southwestern Iran.
Okay.
And this discovery was monumental.
Yeah.
It transformed Iran into a major player in the global oil market almost overnight.
So I imagine this discovery had a huge impact on Iran.
Yeah.
Both economically and politically.
You're absolutely right. The creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum, or BP,
right?
It marked the beginning of large-scale oil production in Iran.
Okay.
And the company built pipelines and refineries and port facilities, creating this modern infrastructure.
Wow.
For extracting and exporting oil.
So on the surface, it seems like Iran was benefiting from this development. Was that really the case?
Well, it's complicated. While oil production did bring some economic benefits to Iran, the vast majority of the profits, they flowed out of the country, mainly to British shareholders and the British government, which held a majority stake in the company.
So the Iranians were essentially providing the resource, but not really reaping the reward.
That's how many Iranians saw it. Yeah, they resented the fact that this foreign company controlled their most valuable asset.
Right.
And that they were receiving only a small share of the profits.
Yeah.
And this resentment, this really fueled nationalist sentiment. And it contributed to political instability in Iran for decades to come.
So it sounds like this oil deal, it created this deep-seated sense of injustice that would have these long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company's presence in Iran became a symbol of Western exploitation and a rallying point for those, seeking greater control over their nation's resources.
Right.
And the question of who benefits from Iran's oil, it remained a source of tension and conflict throughout the 20th century.
It's incredible how these challenges to the British Empire, whether it was in India, Africa, or Iran, they were all driven by this fundamental desire for self-determination.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder what was happening back in Britain during all this. Were people just, cheering on the empire, or were there dissenting voices emerging?
That's a really important question because, empires aren't just built on military strength and economic power.
Right.
They rely on these narratives.
Okay.
On these stories that justify their actions.
Right.
And during this period, those narratives were starting to unravel
Okay.
as news of these costly wars and brutal tactics, it reached the British public.
So how did people back in Britain react to these reports?
Hmm.
Was there like a sense of growing unease
Yeah.
about what the empire was doing in these, far-flung corners of the world?
Definitely. While there was still a strong current of patriotism
Okay.
and a belief in Britain's civilizing mission, there were also, these growing anxieties.
Hmm.
And the Second Boer War in particular had a really profound impact on public opinion.
Why was the Boer War such a turning point?
Well, remember, the British public had been led to believe that this would be a quick and decisive victory.
Right.
But the Boers' stubborn resistance, the high casualty rates,
Yeah.
and then the shocking revelations about the concentration camps,
Right.
it painted this very different picture.
It shattered the illusion of
Yeah.
effortless imperial dominance.
Exactly. And for some, it raised these really serious moral questions about the very nature of empire.
Yeah.
Was it right to subjugate other peoples, even if it was done in the name of progress?
Mm.
Was the cost in terms of human life and suffering justified?
Right.
And these questions were being debated in newspapers, in Parliament, even,
Yeah.
at dinner tables across the country.
So were there organized movements within Britain that were openly critical of imperialism?
Yes, absolutely. Anti-imperialist leagues and societies kind of sprang up.
Okay.
And they drew support from these diverse groups,
Okay.
religious organizations, intellectuals, labor unions,
Mm.
even some members of parliament.
Yeah.
And they argued that imperialism was morally wrong, that it was a drain on Britain's resources,
Yeah.
that it was, dragging the nation into these unnecessary conflicts.
So it sounds like the British Empire was facing a challenge not just from those that it, sought to control, but from within its own society.
Yeah, exactly.
Did these anti-imperialist movements have any real impact on British policy?
Well, it's hard to measure their direct influence on policy.
Okay.
But they certainly contributed to a shift in the national conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The empire was no longer seen as this unquestionable good.
Right.
The costs and consequences were becoming increasingly apparent.
Yeah.
And these critiques of imperialism, these cracks in the narrative of imperial dominance, they would have these long-term repercussions, eventually contributing to the decline of the British Empire of the 20th century.
It's fascinating how empires can be weakened, not just by external forces, but also by this internal dissent.
Right.
By this erosion of belief in their own legitimacy.
Yeah.
It reminds us that power is never absolute.
That's a great point. It's this complex interplay of factors, both internal and external, that ultimately determines the fate of empires.
Yeah.
And the period that we've been discussing really, really highlights those complexities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm really struck by how much we can learn from these challenges to the British Empire.
Yeah.
Even though it, largely ceased to exist decades ago. Why should we care about these events today?
Well, for one thing, I think it helps us understand the long-lasting legacies of colonialism.
Okay.
Many of the political boundaries, the economic disparities,
Right.
the cultural clashes that we see in the world today,
Yeah.
they have roots in this era
Yeah.
of European imperialism.
And by studying these challenges to the British Empire, we can gain this deeper appreciation for the resilience and courage of those who resisted its control. They refused to accept their subjugation and fought for their right to self-determination.
Exactly. Their stories offer these powerful lessons about the human spirit and the importance of challenging injustice.
Yeah.
And the enduring desire for freedom and autonomy.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the streets of Calcutta to the battlefields of South Africa to the oil fields of Iran.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It's a story of ambition and resistance, of power and its limits, but most importantly, it's a story that reminds us that even the mightiest empires are vulnerable to the forces of change.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway.
And that's a lesson that remains incredibly relevant today. So thanks for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the fascinating tapestry of history